Hey guys, it's Matt with the YouTube channel BleepinJeep, and today I want to go over Welding 101. I get a lot of my subscribers that say I don't know how to weld or I don't have a welder. My question to you is, why not? So my hope for this video is to get you into welding the cheapest and quickest way possible. Let's jump right into it. Disclaimer. The purpose of this video is to show my subscribers who think welding is beyond their reach that it's really not. For that reason, I'm not going to cover everything. This is Welding 101 and meant to show the very, very basics. In the video, I might say some things that aren't really true, like there are 3 types of welding. Of course there are more, but if I dove into them all, I would be defeating the purpose of this video. That being said, don't think you can watch this intro video and then go out and weld up a trailer tongue the next day. This video is just meant to get you started practicing. End disclaimer. So the first thing we need to talk about is the 3 basic types of welding. And first is the stick welder. It's this big giant box here, sometimes called a buzz box, and it uses this stick or rod. And you put this on the welding material with your grounding clamp and it basically just burns down until you get to the end. Now this is a cheap method of welding, but it's not the best for our application. Next up we have the Mig Welder. Now this is a wire feed welder. It's very easy to use. You can use it with or without gas. We'll talk about that more later. But basically all you do is set up your grounding clamp, you hold this up to your surface, you press this button, and you weld away. Great for beginners. Now the third type of welding is called TIG, and I don't have this, but it's a tungsten rod with gas. So it's two-handed, it would kind of be like this, and then you use a filler rod. And you also have a foot pedal. So this is more for the professionals. It's very hard to learn. Can be done, but let's start with this one first. We're going to use this, the Mig Welder, to teach you. Okay, so let's open it up and see how a Mig Welder works. Now you can get these in 110 or 220 volts, so it plugs into the wall. Inside we've got a spool of wire. It comes through this little feeder tube here, and there's a little roller, so that pushes the wire through. So there's a few adjustments you can make in here, and one of them is right here, the tensioner. So you can add tension to this to keep it from just unspooling off in here. You can tighten or loosen that. You can also add tension to the roller. So when you first go to feed this wire in, you pull this back, you feed the wire through the tube there, and then you lock it down. You can add tension to make it tighter or looser, and this roller is going to spin here and push that wire out of the tube. The gas comes in right here, and down here there are 2 cables. One goes to the grounding clamp and one goes to your gun. Now you can reverse these, and we'll talk about why. So very quickly, there's 2 different types of wire that you can run in a MIG machine. And side note, of course there are more than 2, but remember, this is Welding 101. MIG machine, and it has to do with whether or not you're using gas. If you're using gas, you use a solid core wire. If you're not using gas, you use a flux core wire, and you don't have to use this gas. Basically, it has the flux on the inside instead of a shielding gas. In this case, you're not going to get as good of a weld, but you can weld outside with the flux core. Also, you'll need to reverse the polarity when you're using the flux core. And all I mean by reversing the polarity is you're going to swap these 2 leads around. So let's take a look at the front of the machine here. There's 2 settings. One is your wire feed speed, and basically that just means how fast that wire is coming out. So the more I crank this up, the faster that wire starts shooting out. Number 2 is the voltage, and that really depends on the thickness of the metal that you're welding. So this would be really thick stuff, and this would be thin, like sheet metal. So this wire right here goes down to your grounding clamp, and this one right here goes to your gun. There's a trigger right here that's going to start you welding, and then there's consumables on the end. So this is the nozzle right here. Anything that you use up is a consumable. Then you have the tip, that's where the wire goes through, and that unscrews off of there. And then this is the gas nozzle. The gas comes out through these little holes. And lastly, if you're using solid core wire and not flux wire, you will have a bottle of gas. Now inside of here is 75% argon, 25% CO2, and you also have this regulator which controls the flow. The next thing we should talk about is safety. So first let's start with gloves. there's different types of gloves. These are heavy, thick gloves, mainly for stick welding. And then you've got some less thick gloves. These are for MIG welding, and I don't have the TIG gloves, but they're very similar to this. Usually they are real thin so that you can handle the little rod that you need to move back and forth to do your TIG welding. You need to wear gloves. It's going to get hot. Number 2, you need to have cotton clothing, head to toe. You can get a severe sunburn from welding, so you need to be covered. I wear cotton clothing. It won't melt whenever sparks get thrown on it. You also should invest in a welding jacket. This is just a fireproof jacket to go over me. That way if I'm wearing short sleeves or something, I can just pop this on and it keeps all of the sparks and everything on the jacket and not my more expensive clothing. Shoes. You need to get leather shoes with no laces. I can't tell you how many shoes I've burned through forgetting to put these on. So these are great because they can't get the sparks down in there. If you have any kind of shoes that have laces, the laces will catch on fire, but also the sparks and slag and stuff will get down in there and burn the crap out of you. And of course you need a hood. So the hood is to protect your eyes because it's going to be very, very bright. So in the past, you had to look and see what you're doing and then pop that down right before you started welding. But now they have these auto darkening helmets. So the light hits here, and then it tells it to shut down so that you can see while you're getting set up. And then as soon as you start welding, it gets really dark so that it protects your eyes. Have to have a helmet. Next, you'll need a fire extinguisher handy. In case you do happen to set something on fire, you'll want to be able to put it out, of course. You also want to check your surroundings. Probably not going to be good welding with propane bottles and flammable materials under your welding table. And last, whenever you're welding, you're going to have fumes coming up. So you need to have a ventilated area. You don't want to be breathing those fumes. Also, the way the helmet is designed, you put your chin down and the fumes will hit this helmet and go around your face so that you're not breathing those constantly. So make sure that you put your chin down, the fumes will go around you, and then have a well-ventilated area. You can open a window or something like that. And you can also buy a welding ventilation system with the hood that comes over your work area if you really want to. So let's move on to the good stuff, but first here is a pro tip from an anonymous fellow.
Pro tip. A good machine makes all the difference in the world. Think of it this way. Even a professional tennis player is not going to be able to win a match with a cheap-ass racket.
So that being said, I bought this really nice welder for about $750 on Craigslist. So shop around, but if you need to buy new, check the link in the description below. I'll link a link to you for the Hobart Handler, which is a welder that we've reviewed in the past. It's really great for beginners and is only about $500. Okay, so wire size. .030 is pretty much standard and is what I use. If you're going to be welding thin sheet metal, you can go thinner. If you're going to be welding something thick, you can go thicker. But 030 should pretty much cover everything and is right in the middle. Everything needs to match though. Your tip needs to match. There's a liner in the gun which needs to match, and your rollers in the machine, which we talked about earlier, needs to match that 030. Your welder should come with a chart. Ours is on the inside here. You'll want to take a look at this chart and start here. So we're using 75-25 on the gas, 030 wire, and depending on which material thickness you're going to be using, let's start at 1/4 inch. So that is 575. You'll want to start there as a beginner, and you can adjust from there whether you think you need it hotter or colder or faster or slower. So if you're using gas, you'll get this gas bottle from a welding supply house. Usually you rent them by the year, and you just pay to have them filled whenever you need to. And you hook it up to this regulator, which usually comes with the welder. It just screws into the bottle of gas. You turn on the gas. This tells you how much gas you have in the entire tank. And then this is your regulator for how much is going out through the other side. And you can adjust that right here through this little screw. Usually it's going to be between 20 and 30 CFH. Okay guys, before we even start, the number one rule to welding and getting a good weld is preparation. If I were to try to weld these pieces like this that have rust and are dirty, you would get a bad weld no matter how good you are. What you want to do is get one of these angle grinders with a flat disc on it and clean up your welds. You want to have solid, bright steel before you even start welding. So anything that you're going to weld, you clean up the edge until it's bright, and then you'll get a perfect, nice weld. Now the next thing you should do is practice, practice, practice. And you want to practice on 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch. Welding thin sheet metal like what's on a car is an art form. You need to save that until you are good. So when you're practicing, you want to practice on thicker stuff. This is 1/8 inch. This is 1/4 inch. You should also know that it's very difficult to weld something that's very thin to something that's very thick. So learn the basics first before you try to do something like that. The next thing that you should know is when you're welding, these pieces of metal will get hot and they'll warp. It's not that important when we're practicing here, but if you've got a finished piece and you don't want it to warp, you need to clamp it down to the table to keep it from bending. These clamps are really cheap. You can buy them for a couple bucks a piece, and you need to have a few of them. The next thing you need to know is that you need to have a good ground to bare metal. If you're working on a car or something that's painted, you'll need to find a spot where you can grind it down to bare metal and get a good ground clamp. You will not have a good weld if you don't have a ground to bare metal. So a good weld is all about being comfortable. I can't stress this enough. Imagine if you're trying to weld out here like this, you have to be super precise in your little tiny movements. So if you're out here like this, it's going to be terrible. What you need to do is use 2 hands, your feet, your elbows, whatever you can use. So I like to do this. I like to spread my feet. I hold the gun with one hand. I put my other hand up like this and rest it right here. And I use my elbow whenever possible. I also have this clamp right here and I can set my arm on it. So that makes me very, very comfortable, very steady. And now I can do small, tiny, minute motions and get a great looking weld without being all crazy like this. Okay, there's just a couple more things we need to discuss before we can start welding, and one of them is pattern. So there's lots of different patterns. They're all personal. You can choose whichever one you like, but I'm going to go over the basic 3. The first one is the U pattern. So you just make little tiny U's as you go across the weld area, just like this. You go up, 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 all the way across. The next one is the cursive E pattern. So you're just making these little tiny cursive E's as you're going across with your gun. And the next one is the back and forth. The back and forth doesn't make a very good looking weld. Sometimes you have to use it when you're in a tight area, so you just kind of weave back and forth like this. This is the one I'm going to use right here. The next order of business is, should you push or should you pull? Side note, many people argue over the push-pull theories. Even the professionals can't agree, so keep that in mind when you read the comments below. And it really depends on you, what you prefer, and also it really doesn't matter because you're going to have to do both. Sometimes there'll be a situation where you have to pull, sometimes there'll be a situation where you have to push. So you're going to have to learn how to do both. The main thing is that if you're doing a flat weld like this, you don't want to have your gun down here as you're coming across. You want it to be pretty much vertical, straight up as you're pushing or as you're pulling. So you want it to be like this, or like you want it to be more straight up and down like this, but you still have to be able to look into there. So that's the one main thing that messes people up. When they have to peer into there, they start moving the gun down. So you want to keep that in mind. Make sure that the gun is very vertical like this, and you're going to aim it towards push or aim it back towards the pull, and you'll have to have it sideways a little bit so you can see what's going on there. And the different types, the push and pull and straight up and down, penetrate in different ways, and they also make it look different. So you'll see as you practice, and you'll figure out which one you like to use. Okay, there's also different ways you can set up the metal. This is a butt joint, and then you have what's called a fillet weld, so you're welding in this 45-degree angle right here, or this 90-degree angle with your gun at a 45-degree angle. You also have a T-joint, and you have like a inside corner joint, an outside corner joint. All those aren't that important right now. What we're just going to be doing here is practicing. But just make sure that if you're doing a flat butt weld like this, you're kind of coming over the top. If you're doing an inside corner like this, you're at a 45 degree as you're coming across. And you also want to be very aware of your stick out. So what stick out is this little wire. When you press this button, this wire comes out. You want to keep that as short as possible, so about 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch. The reason being is the further that wire starts sticking out, let's say it were to stick out an inch, you would have a really bad weld because the power, it loses power as it comes out. Also, you lose your shielding gas. So you want to make sure that you keep it really tight in close so that you have that power, you have that shielding gas, and everything is working really good. Also, you can move your nozzle back and forth so that the tip is further in or further out. I like to have the tip a little bit in like that. So it just is preference. You can kind of check it out on your own as you practice. But you can pull this tip back to where the tip, you can pull the nozzle back to where the tip is kind of sticking out a little bit, or you can push the nozzle forward where the tip is recessed in there a little further. Also, I mentioned cleaning the metal, but also if you can bevel the edges, I don't know if you can see that, but I've beveled that edge at a 45-degree angle. What that does, when you put your two pieces of metal together, it has a place now for that weld to sit. If you do that, you'll get a much better weld, a better looking weld too, because all that weld will kind of sit into that gap instead of just piling up on the outside. Now, if you can't bevel your edges for some reason, what I would suggest is that you leave a small gap, and that way the weld can kind of penetrate down in there and not just sit on top of the metal. Okay, I think we've talked about it enough. Let's start welding. I'm going to set the machine up for 1/4 inch, which is what we're practicing with. And let's do it. Side note, don't weld galvanized metal, and don't clean your metal with harsh chemicals like brake cleaner. It could kill you. If you haven't used your welder yet this morning, I like to let the gas come through the line because it takes a minute, so you want to let out about 12 inches of line. And then you can cut this with pliers, but what I prefer to do is just let it out and then hold it right here and spark it off. You got to make sure you're careful when you do that, but a lot of times if you don't have your pliers handy, you just put it on the edge of the table and click it real quick, and that'll cut the wire for you. Okay, so before we start welding, we always want to tack our piece, and tacking just means to weld it in 2 little spots or however many spots you need just to hold it in place, and that way it doesn't move on you when you're welding. So you're just going to basically hold it real close like you're going to be welding, but you're not going to move it, and you're going to hold it down for about 3 seconds, and that'll just put a little tack weld there and keep it together. Okay, let's start off by pulling, doing the U pattern. Now normally I would have my head down here, but I'm going to try to pull back and let you guys see. Okay, not bad for a start. For the next one, let's try pushing, doing the U pattern, and I'm going to darken it down so you can see the puddle better. Alright, so there's pulling. There's pushing, both of those using that U pattern. Okay, let's flip it over and we'll do the cursive E pattern, pulling and then pushing. And over here, let's try pushing with the cursive E. Okay, so there's what the cursive E looks like. This was the pulling, and this was the pushing. I think the pushing looks slightly better than the pulling. Now let's do a 90 degree. I'll just tack it first. Alright, now as I was doing that one, I could tell that I needed more amperage and more wire, because that makes sense. When you're in a corner like this, you have more stick out, so you can't get quite as close. So we need to turn it up just a little bit for the next side. Okay, that was much better. So when you're starting out welding, you can get a really nice looking bead and it be too cold. So for that reason, I would recommend, if you're unsure, go up and increase the amperage and burn it in hotter rather than colder. Also, whenever you get these little splatter marks up here, you can come back and clean those up with your angle grinder and flat disc that we talked about earlier. Alright, so I did that a few times, playing around with camera settings to get a better picture of that for you guys in the dark. I also didn't clean my gun because I wanted to show you this. The nozzle of your gun is eventually going to get a buildup of splatter. So what you need to do is pull that off, and you'll want to use these. These are called Mig pliers, and they've got some accessories on there for your Mig gun. But you just take these and you just kind of clean out all that splatter that's accumulated on there, and you will get a much better weld if you do that frequently, because the gas is able to flow around there much better. Also, if it builds up too much, it'll create a short, and a short over here, and it'll make a really nasty looking weld. You can also clean that tip up a little bit too, and these pliers are helpful for removing a hot tip and replacing it. That way you don't burn your little fingers. Alright, so like I said before, practice, practice, practice. I guarantee you that if you just do this for miles and miles at a time, you lay down several rolls of this MIG weld, you will get really good over time. It just takes practice. Practice pushing, practice pulling, practice doing the different techniques that I showed you, the E's, the U's, the straight lines, and you will get good over time. It just takes practice. Alright, I've got 3 more tips for you before we go. Number 1, use the gas instead of the flux core if at all possible. Remember we talked about the argon gas. That's going to make a much better weld than if you try to use flux core wire. and it's gonna be just a little bit more expensive. It's really not that bad. If you do need to weld outside though, that's when you want to use the flux core wire, because if you're welding outside you've got wind. Wind will blow away the gas, so keep that in mind. Also, if you're using the flux core wire, you'll have some slag left behind and you'll have to use one of these little hammers and kind of chip away that slag to get it looking back the way it should. Number 2 is to keep your visor clean. You wouldn't believe how many bad welds I've got, only to realize it was because I couldn't see what I was doing. Over time it just slowly gets worse and worse and you don't realize it. But once you clean this visor you think, oh my goodness, I can see now. I can make a much better weld when I can see. And number 3, if you're getting an inconsistent weld, check your feed roller. Remember I showed you how the wire runs through that little roller, and then this thing is a gun liner. This is inside that tube. It's a liner that the wire goes through. What can happen is you can step on this and kink it, and over time they just get dirty, so you have to replace these every once in a while. So if your wire is coming out inconsistently, check your liner, because it could be kinked, it could be dirty, and that could be what's causing you to have a bad weld. Okay guys, well if you put all those tips to good use, I know that you will be welding in no time. Make sure to hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this video and to subscribe to our channel. We have all the best off-road content on the interwebs, none of the boring stuff. Also check out the website BleepinJeep.com. We have all kinds of great apparel and swag. If you really, really love us here at BleepinJeep, check out patreon.com/BleepinJeep. There you can make a monthly contribution to help support the channel, and you also get some perks. I'll leave you with some video of me welding. We'll see you next time. Well, that's a piece of art right there.